Now, Dr. Kirkwood.
And last week we looked at the idea of the origins of life. Tonight we're going to get into the concept of mind versus brain, but we hadn't finished that other lesson. So we have to finish that other lesson first, and then we'll get into the concept, is there a difference between the mind and the brain? I think most of us would understand that the brain is that physical structure that's inside your skull. Okay, it is a physical structure. You can take it out, look at it. If you're doing cadaver work, you can do surgery on it, so on and so forth. There is a physical structure that we call the brain. Is that the same thing as the mind? Well, you know where I'm going with that, or I probably wouldn't be talking about this. There seems to be a difference between the mind and the brain. And is that important when you're talking to an atheist? Because an atheist cannot accept that there's a mind. If it's a materialist world that they live in, and we live in, and all of our minds, all of our brains are nothing more than a collection of molecules and atoms, there cannot really be a mind. They have to be the same thing. So when we get into these talks later on tonight, where we look at these scientific evidences for the difference, that's what that's about. It's trying to show that there does seem to be a distinct difference. Now, I don't think we'd see that difference in animals. That's a different thing. Only humans have that, the sentient mind. And we're going to look at that. But before we do, we're going to backtrack just a little bit. And last week I talked about DNA. Does anybody remember what I said was the most important thing to remember about last week's lesson about DNA? What is DNA? Information. Right, DNA is information. I said that. I don't think I did a real good job of explaining what I meant by that. So we're going to backtrack just a little bit, because when I got home and started thinking about it, I just sort of threw that out. It is the most important thing to remember about DNA, this remarkable molecule that codes for all the genetic information in every life, be it a plant, be it a bacterium, be it you or me. We all are made up of DNA. That's what God chose to use to create man. When he created man from the dust of the earth, he used DNA. That's just the way he did it. But what is DNA? It is information. It tells the organism what to develop, or it tells what the organism is going to be. So I just want to look at the concept of information just a minute. And some of this is taken from William Dembski's book, The Design Inference. He is part of that intelligent design community that's out of Seattle, Washington. And he looks at the concept of information. So the top line there is nonsensical. I think we'd all agree. This is tantamount to a monkey being allowed to blindly type on a computer or a typewriter. And so this is what he did. And I thought of trying to do a demonstration like that tonight, having one of you come up here and blindly type a typewriter. Not quite the same though, because you kind of know where some of the keys might be, and so it's not quite the same. But if you were to have someone just blindly hit those keys, you'd get something like this, I would venture to say. And that doesn't make any sense at all, does it? Nini, Tog, Jill, Jimnex, HDX, hyphen, comma with the dots in there. Turns out, now, what if you saw, and so if you saw that, what would you surmise? If you just saw that, and you speak English, and you assume that this is an English typewriter that you're looking at, not a Chinese or something else, and you saw that, what would you assume? Does that convey any information to you? I would dare say it doesn't, right? You would think just what I said. A little kid got on the typewriter and just started punching a bunch of keys. That's what you would assume, because that doesn't mean anything. But what if you read this 77 years ago? Well, you'd say, well, that's the beginning of the Gettysburg Address, right? Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. That conveys meaning. That's information. That's what information is. Now, when you look at probability, I wrote the word probability at the bottom of that. What is the probability of randomly typing in 77 years ago, or Nini, Todd, Jill, Jim X, HDX? What is the probability of randomly typing those in? Does anybody want to venture a guess? It's the same. It's the same. The probability of randomly doing that is also the same probability of putting in 77 years ago. Very high probability that you wouldn't do any of that randomly. But what's the difference? The difference is this is a target. Now we know what this has meaning to it. We've now identified a target. It's a target phrase. Therefore, it becomes very improbable that would ever happen as far as information goes. And the first part of that information, you have to remember all this, I'm just trying to point it out, is something called Shannon information, where the second part of that was pattern. It conveyed meaning. And that is the difference in the two. But the random probability of going in and randomly typing those things is actually the same if you blindly did it, wouldn't it? But you didn't blindly do that other one. Somebody put meaning behind it, and they put those words together. They were not blindly put in. But the randomness is the same. It's kind of like flipping a coin. Every time you flip a coin, heads or tails, what's the probability that's going to come up heads or tails? 50-50, every time. But what if I flipped that coin 100 times and it came out heads every time? That would be fairly improbable, would it not? But it turns out, again, it would be the same probability if I flipped that coin 100 times and it came out randomly as well. The probabilities are the same. But if I told you I'm going to flip that coin 100 times and it's going to come up heads every time, and it happened, what would you surmise? If you were a thinking person, if you were a gambling person and you bet someone you were going to do that, what would you surmise if you did that? Yeah, it's rigged. The coin is rigged. You got a trick coin. You got a coin that has two heads on it, or there's something magnetic going on. I don't know, because do you know what the odds are of flipping a coin 100 times in a row heads are? Yeah, I know you don't know it, because I don't even know the number, but it's trillions and trillions. I did look up the odds of flipping a coin just 19 times in a row, and it's like 1 in 10 billion. 1 in 10 billion, and that's only 19 times in a row. So if you extrapolate that to 100, so if I, though, called my shot, so to speak, we would say that's very, very, very highly improbable that I would do that. And in fact, if somebody did that, you would say it's got to be rigged. The deal has to be rigged. Well, that's what information is. I don't know how well that came out over there at the very top, but any of our computer people know what, in that white area there on the top, what that is? I mean, you don't need to tell me what it says, but what does it just look like to you? It's a binary code, and it codes for something. And so I don't know much about computers. I mean, Darwin's black box was the cell of the animal. My black box is this thing right here. I know nothing about computers and very little about binary codes, but I know that information doesn't go into a computer randomly, does it? Somebody puts it in there. And so Stephen Meyer, in his book Signature in the Cell, talks about this at some length. And here's the deal. What that is right there is actually, when in the course of human events, it's the beginning of, I think, our Constitution. And that's not the whole thing, by the way. You can actually download the entire binary code for the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, so on and so forth. Point is that that's information. Now, do you think you would get that same information if you just blindly went in there and started putting in zeros and ones? No, you wouldn't. And that wouldn't be information. That would be nonsense. Well, DNA is exactly the same way. This is very similar. Only instead of zeros and O's, remember last week we talked about guanine and cytosine and adenosine and so forth, and those are the nucleic acids, the bases of the nucleic acids that code for information. So those are a bunch of letters lined up in a row there, and these are not random letters, as you can imagine, or I wouldn't have them up there. These are letters that stand for RNA polymerase. That's just one of many enzymes in our body that are necessary for life, and your body has thousands and thousands of these. And these are not 100 letter codes, friends. These are more than 100 letter codes in most cases. In some cases, thousands of letters of codes. So the point is, those letters have to be arranged in a certain order to get the information that produces life. They can't be random. And so the question goes back to, that's begged in part of Stephen Meyer's book, Signatures in the Cell, is where does that information come from? High improbable things do not normally occur. And you can talk about the DNA molecule forming on its own, that's fine, but you haven't even got to first base hardly when you've done that. Because once that DNA molecule has formed, now you've got to start ranging up those nucleic acids to produce proteins. And without that, the DNA molecule is nothing. That's why I said, the most important thing about the DNA molecule is that it is information. And I'm going to make a statement tonight, and I'll probably make it at least a couple more times. Now, the fact that we can know this does not take away from the fact that there's God. In fact, it actually, to me, proves the presence of intelligent design even more. The fact that we can discover this. We can discover these things. And so very complex things that 100 years ago we knew nothing about. DNA, the molecule DNA has only been around since 1953 as far as the knowledge of the structure. In the course of human history, that's not a long time, is it? But yet, 100 years ago or so, we knew nothing about the DNA molecule. Nothing, actually even less than 100 years. Because I was 53 and I ain't 100 yet, 1953. So the fact that we can find out how things work. You go to the book of Job, and we'll look at that next week, where God is talking to Job about the things he knows nothing about. Some of those things we know about now. Doesn't take away from the fact that God created them that way, the fact that we can actually discover them. The fact, for example, that we can discover DNA, the fact that we can discover some of the, I use the concept of calculus. It's often been said that Newton was the invented calculus. Newton didn't invent calculus. He discovered it. The laws behind calculus were already there, but he discovered them. Who put those laws there? God did. That's sort of my point. So when we look at purpose, and the word they use a big word called teleology. Teleology is all about purpose. The concept isn't, well, because we can't understand something, that means God made it. Well, the same thing with this black box. I don't understand it either, but God didn't make it, a man did. But it's the point that because it's so complex, it took intelligence to do it, and that intelligence had to be God. Bill Gates, if anybody knows anything about computers, I guess it would be him. And he's not necessarily a friend of intelligent design, mind you, but when he looks at the DNA molecule, he knows what it looks like. He says DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. So he understands the complexity of it, and that's the point. So let's go back now. We were looking at origins of life last week, and we looked at how mankind has tried to create life. They've gone into the lab, the Stanley Miller and his professor Urey, the famous Miller-Urey experiment, whatever you want to call it, also done in the 1950s, set up this apparatus to try to create life, and indeed he created a few little residues of amino acids, and it is touted as a great experiment to show that life could evolve spontaneously. But all of those experiments, the Miller-Urey had lots of problems, and nobody even now believes it's a valid experiment. But they've done lots of experiments since then, and those experiments have the same actual problem, and that is there's human mind behind them. They are not spontaneous. So life had to occur spontaneously without any intelligence behind them. But what amazes me is with all the knowledge that we have of DNA, all the knowledge we have of biology, and all the knowledge we have in chemistry and quantum physics, so on and so forth, mankind has still yet to create anything that looks remotely like human life, or any life. We haven't created anything like. We've set up experiments that have come up with a few simple compounds like amino acids, but that's a far, far cry from life, because even once you get those amino acids, remember, the amino acids are what are coded in that DNA that produce the protein, and you have to have the code to do it. So a bunch of amino acids floating around in a jar doesn't get you anything. It's just amino acids. They have to be put in an order to create the simplest of enzymes and proteins. And so we looked at those experiments and how they all were flawed. They all needed reagent. The pH and the temperature had to be controlled. There was no target. That's a big one to me. These experiments assume there's going to be a target. Well, if things are occurring randomly and in nature, there's no target. Happenstance doesn't know that we want to build an eye, for example. There's no target for that. So where did the target come from? They can't answer that. There's a few other problems too. And one of them is the enzyme issue. So they talk about building DNA. You just heard me refer to this RNA polymerase. It's an enzyme that's necessary to build the proteins. Hence, without that enzyme, you don't build anything. Even if you had the information, you need that polymerase to build the protein. So the question I would have is, where did the enzyme come from? If you can't build something before you even have the enzyme, it doesn't do you any good to have the information. That's a big problem when it comes to origin of life. Do you understand what I'm saying? You need that enzyme. The enzyme had to be created. So you're going to create the enzyme first when the enzyme would not have any function without the amino acids there to begin with? Doesn't make sense, does it? You would have to have both. So you'd have to have evolution evolving both the RNA polymerase and the information for the proteins at the same time. And nobody believes that. But there's not a good answer for this. There's not a good answer for this. We have another problem. We said, and we'll mention this later, the whole concept of life is based upon the concept that we're all made up of cells. It's all life is made up of cells, either one cells or many cells. In the case of human beings, it's trillions of cells. And that number varies between which textbook you read, by the way, how many trillions it is. But let's just say it's a whole lot. There's a lot of cells. You've got to have a cell membrane to build a cell. So now if you have the information to build a cell, but you don't have a cell membrane, then you've got nothing. None of these proteins can survive outside of a cell. They have to have a cell. And so cells are made up, and especially in animal life, there's this lipid cell membrane. And it's a problem because you can't build life without the cell wall, the cell membrane, and yet you've got to have that cell membrane to build life. And so it's the chicken and egg problem. You can't build an organism without the cellular membrane. And it's not just for protection. That's a picture that we found in one of our textbooks. These are individual cells, and it may be hard to see up there, but the cell membrane is what outlines those cells. They are usually bi-layer, and you can kind of see that. There's an inside layer, there's an outside layer, and this is a light microscope view of cell membranes. I'm not sure what animal this is taken from, but these are multiple cells. You can see the nucleus in the cell right there, the big round thing that's necessary. There's a lot of stuff in those cells that you can't see, but I'm primarily focusing on the cell membrane here. But the cell membrane has all sorts of functions. It's not just a protection. And Toby and those that are in the medical field knows what I'm talking about here. Cells control the movement of substances in and out the cell. You have to have just the amount of water inside that cell. Too much water and the cell explodes. Not enough water and the cell dries up. Anybody here survive very long in the Sahara Desert without water? The answer would be no. Your cells would dry up and you would die. So we need water. Water is the essence of life to a large extent. You have to have that. But that water has to be carefully controlled. Too much in and the cell explodes, too much in and it dries out. And the cell membrane controls that. Where did that information come from? Also, the cells are involved in adhesion and ion conductivity and cell signaling. It's the anchor for the cytoskeleton, and this is a big one here, endocytosis. It engulfs certain molecules. We know as doctors, a lot of the medications that we use, for example, you've probably heard of the calcium channel blockers. Anybody taking a calcium channel blocker for their blood pressure? What does those calcium channel blockers do? They regulate how much calcium goes into the cell. In that particular case, the muscle cell that surrounds your arteries. And when you relax the calcium, you relax the artery, and as a result, the artery relaxes and your blood pressure goes down. That's all regulated at the cell membrane level. And there's many, many, many medications. The cell membrane is extremely complex. That's my point. And you cannot have life without the cell membrane, but how could you ever get it if you didn't have it? You can't. It's a big problem, and it's not well explained. So now again, kind of like the other concept, you're going to have to build the cell membrane first, and then you're going to have to build life before, and there's no evidence that that's ever happened. It's a big problem. We talk about DNA, and we talk about how highly unlikely DNA would ever occur by itself. There's actually a bigger problem, and this is taken from Dr. James Tour. I mentioned him last time, out of Rice University, brilliant fellow, and he has looked at some of these things. It's actually even harder to build a carbohydrate molecule than it is DNA. And he says it's 1 in a 6 trillion chance of arranging a carbohydrate molecule. And yet you got to have the carbohydrate molecule to even begin building DNA, because one of the components of DNA is ribose, deoxyribose nucleic acid. Ribose is a carbohydrate. It's a type of sugar. It's more difficult to get the carbohydrate than it is even to get the DNA. And so we got 1 in a trillion. That's a pretty high probability, wouldn't you think? What do you think? And this is one that this one you probably never heard of. I had never heard of it until I heard Dr. Tour talk. And it's called the interactomes. Interactomes are a whole set of molecular interactions that occur within the cell. The origin of life people never mention interactomes. It's too complex for them. It's too hard. They can't explain it. So they will never mention the word interactomes. Well, interactomes, one more time, is this molecular interactions that have to occur within cells. Without interactomes, there is not life. And that is never, ever mentioned in the origin of life experiments. Just one yeast cell has 10 to the 79 followed by 9 zeros behind it power of interactomes that have to be there in combination for it to function. And if you look at the bottom there, there's only estimated, these are estimated, obviously nobody knows for sure, there's only 10 to the 94th power elements in the universe. And that's an extremely larger number than that. So interactomes are a big issue for origin life people. And we don't understand large numbers. I don't understand large numbers. When you start getting 10 to the 27th power or 10 to the 7,000 power, in that case, a ridiculous number, we don't understand. This is just to give you a little bit of an idea of what large numbers mean. So 10 to the 6th power, if you had that many seconds, that would be 1 million seconds equals a day. That's 10 to the 6th seconds we're talking about here. 10 to the 9th, doesn't seem like a big jump, does it? But 10 to the 9th with 1 billion seconds in a year, and 10 to the 12th would be 1 trillion seconds, and it would equal 32,000 years. So you go from a day to a year to 32,000 years in the course of 6, 9, 12. That gives you an idea of how big those numbers are. And those numbers are much, much larger than that. So, Dr. Tour, James Tour, life does not exist without interactomes, and that's never, ever even mentioned. Now, some people have proposed that they have built the protocell. And that's, again, come from Dr. Tour. I admittedly use a lot of his information here because the stuff was kind of new to me. And so the protocell is supposed to be the new cell. And this is how Dr. Tour put it. These protocells, and Dr. Tour's got the credentials, by the way. I mentioned that last time. A PhD, does nanotechnology, builds biologic nanomachines. He's very, very brilliant, and he does hard science, is published widely. He says this is how the supposed protocells are supposed to work. It's like buying 20 pounds of turkey meat, adding 1 gallon of turkey broth, adding a few turkey feathers, applying a little energy, and poof, out walks the turkey. Well, of course that doesn't happen, but it's kind of like that. Protocell, again, origin of life people have not come close to making anything that remotely looks like life. Well, somebody's going to say, and this is Dr. Tour also, man cannot assemble life even if he has everything. Can't do it. We can't do it. We can't make life. Well, I mentioned this in my book, The Evolution Delusion, and it's still cogent, and Dr. Tour even brought this up. Back in 2010, Craig Venter, who was a doctor with a PhD, him and his team, and they're still working trying to create life, what they would call life. They supposedly created this new bacteria. And what they did is they took a copy of an existing bacterial genome, transplanted it into another cell where they took the nucleus out of the cell. Now, just to a lay person like myself, that doesn't sound like creating life to me, does it you? No, it's kind of like taking the Chevrolet chassis and putting in a Mercedes motor and saying, I've created a new car. Well, you didn't create the motor, you didn't create the chassis, but you created something. It was a big deal, but it was not creating life. All he did was transplant genetic bacteria from one genome into another cell. He didn't create the cell, but he did splice the genome together. It's not anywhere near what we're talking about. And what is unfortunate is that current origin of life experiments, they do try to mislead, because if you were to talk to the average person, average student in either high school or college, they would think that these origin of life experiments are going crazy and that we're going to soon have new life. Who knows? Maybe they will. I don't know. But they haven't come close yet, and they are totally mislead. And Dr. Tour pointed to Deuteronomy 13, 3 and 4. This is not talking about the origin of life, obviously. but it's sort of a similar thing. You got to be careful when you hear these false, grandiose claims that are not true. And it's easy to get bogged down thinking they know what they're doing. They are false prophets is what they are. He says, Deuteronomy 13 says, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice. You shall serve him and hold fast to him. So just be careful of those false claims. We're going to move on. We don't have a lot of time. Quickly, we've already talked about this. All cells are made of life. Here it says human body has 50 trillion. You'll hear 30. You'll hear other numbers. That's not the point. The point is it's a lot. All starting with one. And that is the concept of totipotent. We don't know how one cell is, how God has caused one cell to organize itself to become heart, lung, muscle, bone, but it happens. Something signals inside that cell. But yet, every cell of your body is totipotent. If you were theoretically, you could take one cell of your body and make a clone of you. That's what a clone is. I'm not talking about the gametocytes, but your somatocytes, like in your skin or a muscle. That's where stem cells come from, or the concept of stem cells. You can take a cell and it can become another structure, like a muscle or a heart or a lung. And all cells in your body have that total potential. And that's what cloning is. It's taking one cell. Now, have they cloned? Yeah, they've cloned sheep. And my brothers and I wrote a book on that too. It talks about cloning. I forget if it's Dr. Ron or Dr. John that wrote that section. But cloning's not creating life. You're taking life that already exists and you're causing it to grow, but you're not causing new life to occur. Here's a concept that you may not have thought about. All the cells in your body are constantly changing. You are not who you were 7 years ago per Dr. Tour. All your molecules have changed. Your cells have changed. You got new cells. So, but I still remember being me 7 years ago, don't you? Man, I remember being me 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And that's what we're getting into now. It's this idea of where is that person, the mind versus the brain. So your memory lingers and you have a sense of self, even though all the molecules in your brain have turned over within 7 years. And Rene Descartes first said, I think, therefore I am. There's something different. And I'm going to go through this quickly because this discourse is not really to get into the soul-spirit separation. And I can just say Jerry could do a much better job on that than I could ever do. But sometimes you have to look at the context to know, are we talking about the soul, the part of the man that doesn't die, or are we talking about the part that animates us? But the Bible clearly speaks that there's a difference. In 1 Thessalonians, now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your whole spirit, soul, and body be preserved blameless at the coming of the Christ. If those weren't different, why did he state them differently? So there's something different about the spirit, soul, and body. And that's not the only verse. Hebrews 4:12. The word of God is living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit. There is something different there. And joints and marrow, that's the body again, and is a discerner of thoughts, the intents of the heart. Now they're interconnected, clearly. You know, your soul and your mind are interconnected. But fear not those who can kill the body, but to kill the soul. There's something about us that goes on living. That definition of soul is certainly implied here. And also in James 2:26, for as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead. So the spirit can be looked upon as the soul. So where is your mind? That's the question I have. If I were to go inside your brain and try to locate a point in your brain where I could say, there's the mind, where would that be? Answer is we don't know. And again, the materialist would say there's not even a thing such as the mind. But mind does not equal brain. This is a neurosurgeon who ought to know, I think, Dr. Michael Egnor. Ancient Greeks knew that there was a difference. They said your mind was your brain plus the void. That sounded like my mind. But they knew there was something different. But early in the 20th century, early to mid 20th century, ever heard of B.F. Skinner? B.F. Skinner was a behaviorist. He didn't believe in the mind. He believed it was irrelevant, that everything was determined by reward and punishment. B.F. Skinner. I read a lot of B.F. Skinner when I was doing psychology in my in my undergraduate work at the University of Houston. It's an untenable argument. It doesn't fly, and we'll look at why in a minute. Then there was this idea of identity theory that was popular in the 60s and 70s, and it said mind equal brain. There was nothing different between the mind equal brain. We don't have time to go into all those theories. I'm just pointing these out. It was untenable as well. The materialists then were forced to accept that there could not be a mind. What else choice did they have? They just didn't have one. And they referred to this as eliminative materialism. We've eliminated the mind, I guess is the concept there, because there can't be one. It all has to be materialistic. But science suggests evidence, and it suggests otherwise. I'm going to give real quickly about 5 experiments that have been done in the past, or 5 evidences that have been done in the past that try to show that distinction between mind and brain. You can do with that with whatever you want, but to me it implies a higher intelligence, and that we are more than just our anatomy and just our physical makeup. And the first is split brain surgeries. Split brain surgeries were popular years ago. I don't know if they still do these or not. Toby, do you know? I don't know if they do them or not. But years ago, when they could not control seizure, they had no other choice but to do these. And these surgeons would actually split the brain in half. They go right down the middle. Corpus callosum is what separates the right half from the left half. They would go right down the middle and literally split the cortex in half. Well, if your brain and mind were the same thing, you would think that'd cause a whole lot of problems, would you not? I'm splitting the mind in half. Now I've got 2 personalities, a right and a left. But I think I jumped ahead there. What he found was, what Dr. Sperry found was, looking at this people, and he did research and he published his research, and he said there was really no difference after doing that in the personality and the thoughts of these people that had their brain split in half. So to him that meant there had to be something besides brain and mind. That was his conclusion, at least. And then this is Dr. Wilder Penfield. Not the same surgeries, but he did thousands of surgeries on people's brains. People with really bad things like, tumors and things of this nature, aneurysms and things of this nature, where he changed the architecture of the brain quite a bit. And what he found was nothing he ever did really changed that person's sense of self, personality, or consciousness. Seemed to be something different besides just brain and mind, according to Dr. Penfield. The fundamental core of a person's being he could not change with these surgeries. And so he also observed there was no such thing as intellectual seizures. What do we mean by that? Well, a seizure is, you know what a seizure is. You black out and you may have convulsions of the muscles and so forth. But nobody ever has a seizure where they're doing calculus all of a sudden. There's no such thing as that. So that those abstract thoughts are different. And also we see this, I don't know if I have a slide on this or not, but in the brain there are certain things that we can identify, vision and speech. We know where those patterns are, movement and so forth. But there are no spots in the brain that have been identified yet for the intellectual part of the brain. There's no spot in the brain for doing calculus. They haven't found that spot yet. So Penfield he became a dualist now. The word dualist just means he believes there's a difference between mind and brain. Then there's experiments have been done on the deep vegetative state. You know what that is, I'm sure. That's where someone is in a deep coma. They can't talk. They don't do anything. They lie there. For all intents and purposes, they appear to be dead. There's no activity going on. They looked at these people with something called functional MRIs. Functional MRI, you know what an MRI is? It's an imaging of the brain. And they would ask these people questions, or they would give them some ideas. And when they would ask these people that were in deep vegetative state these questions, parts of their brain would light up. Now they're not communicating, they're not talking, their brain is severely damaged, to put it mildly. They're severely damaged. But these portions of the brain would light up when these questions were asked. Well, you could say, well, they're just responding to the sound. They're not actually responding to the question, like play tennis or something like that, the questions they would ask. But if they asked them something that was totally nonsensical, the brain wouldn't light up. They were processing these things. And so there's something that was going on these functional MRIs that would suggest, even in severely brain damaged people, something else was going on. So agents other than the mind cannot be destroyed by brain damage. And this is an interesting one. I found this one fascinating. It was the free won't experiment done by Benjamin Libet. So what he did, he took electrodes that he would record brain activity when he would ask you to push a button. Okay, so he says, okay, go ahead and push a button. It turns out that the brain would light up, and then the person would tell them when they realized they needed to push the button. Kind of a complex experiment. Their brain would light up a half second before they pushed the button, or before they thought of pushing the button. I should make that real clear. It would spike before they even thought of pushing the button. You say, get ready to push a button. When you get ready to do it, light up, and then they would tell you when they were going to press the button. But there was no spike when you decided not to do something. So the materialists took that first part of that equation and said, here, I told you the mind and the brain are the same thing because of this gap there. I tell you the same thing. But when they told them, now I want you to not do something, there was no spike. And so that was an evidence that there's an idea of free want. There seems to be a free will or free want, and he called this readiness potential. But there's not this idea of readiness want. There's nothing lit up, and that's kind of unusual because as you get older, this gets better. The conclusion: we are constantly bombarded with unconscious matters that we're capable of ignoring and avoiding without necessarily brain activity. So the mind is not a product of a materialistic brain. And then this is the last one, and that's good because we're running out of time. This is intentionality. Now, this one's hard to explain, really hard to explain if you think the brain is nothing but a bunch of molecules. And that is the ability for something to be about something else. If my brain is just material, why would the concept of San Francisco just pop in it? That's what this means. I can think of something that I'm not being exposed to. I'm intentionally thinking of something. And if my brain was nothing but molecules, why would I be able to do that? And yet we do it all the time. We make plans, we can think of things. So the ability for something to be about something else, you're not going to explain that with just molecules in the brain. So it is unique to the mind. It's not something we see in the brain. To intentionally think about anything is something unique to the mind. And so matter is not about anything. Nature reflects this teleology, and matter is, for example, and this gets down to the concept of purpose. Everything that when we look at the body, what's the first thing we do if we're an anatomist, or especially years ago when we didn't know about all this stuff? We want to know what that thing does in the body, don't we? If we walk upon something out in nature, we want to know what that thing does. We want to look at the idea of purpose, and that's unique to the mind as well. And Michael Agnor says, you cannot explain a living thing without explaining what that purpose is. And I believe that's true, whether it be the heart, the eyes, the lung. And then I think even Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians. We don't have time to go in that. So next week, read lesson 6, if you will. I think it'll make the classes more interesting if you read it ahead of time. I'm always adding stuff to it, so it won't have everything on there we're talking about, because I'm always thinking of other stuff and I don't have time to get that in there. But you'll be better prepared next week when we'll really get into the evolution part next week. We really get into the big thing there, because evolution is the only explanation for life the materialists have. They haven't come up with a new one yet. So we'll be looking at that next week. Thank you.